Out here, winter doesn't just freeze water, it freezes time. And when it thaws, it doesn't give back what it took. That's why folks in the high country don't trust surprises. But Lena Mallory didn't have that luxury. One morning, she opened her barn door and found a stranger curled in her straw like God had tossed him there on a gamble. No name, no story, just a letter to a bride who never answered, a pair of burned hands, and eyes that didn't ask for mercy. What happened next? Well, I reckon you wouldn't believe me if I told you it involved fire. Silence. A man who built cradles before he dared hope for a child. And a father who hadn't spoken a kind word in 10 years until the day he handed over the deed to the land. This isn't a love story made of lace and ribbon. It's one carved from ash and timber, stitched with quiet promises, and held together by the kind of loyalty that doesn't need to shout to be heard. What would you have done if the man meant for someone else ended up being the only one who stayed? Leave your thoughts down. In the comments, I'd love to hear how you felt about this story. The wind, a raw and biting thing, had scoured the plains for 3 days straight, piling snow in drifts that sculpted the familiar lines of the Mallory homestead into something alien and new. June Mallory, her breath pluming white in the pre-dawn chill, pulled her worn sheepskin collar tighter. 24 years she'd weathered these Montana winters, each one seeming to bite a little deeper, not just into the land, but into the spirit. The farm, her father's pride, and now their shared burden, felt tired, its resources stretched thin as an old blanket. Inside the barn, the air was a degree less hostile, thick with the warm, dusty scent of hay and horse. Old Bess, their single remaining plow horse, nickered softly as June approached with the morning's meager ration of oats. It was in the dim, flickering light of the lantern she carried that she saw it. A shape, a darkness in the empty stall beside Bess, a space that should have held nothing but shadows and straw. Her heart gave a painful thud against her ribs. Coyotes, maybe, or a mountain cat, driven down by hunger. She raised the lantern higher, her hand, steady from years of farm work, now trembling just a fraction. It was a man. He lay sprawled on his stomach, half buried in the loose hay, one arm flung out as if reaching for something he'd lost in the fall. Snow dusted his dark coat and the brim of a battered hat that lay near his head. Unconscious, or worse, for a long moment, June just stood there, the wind whistling through the ill-fitting barn door, the only sound save for Bess's nervous shifting. This was Mallory land. Strangers didn't just happen by, not in this unforgiving stretch of country, not in the dead of winter. And if they did, her father, Walter, would have words for them, sharp ones. Walter, the thought of him galvanized her. He was a man carved from the same harsh landscape they inhabited, stern, unyielding, his displeasure a palpable force that filled their small cabin more effectively than any shouted word. A slammed door from Walter could curdle milk. An upturned bowl at supper spoke volumes of disappointment. A spoon bent out of shape beside his plate was a verdict. She couldn't let him find this man. Not yet, not until she knew. Setting the lantern on a nearby rail, June knelt. The cold from the frozen earth seeped through her trousers. Gingerly, she reached out, her gloved hand hesitating before touching his shoulder. "Mr.," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Mister, can you hear me?" No response. His stillness was absolute. She pressed her fingers to the side of his neck, fumbling for a pulse beneath the rough collar of his shirt. A faint, thready beat. Alive. Then, just, with a grunt of effort, she rolled him onto his back. His face was pale, stubbled with several days' growth of dark beard, and there was a nasty-looking cut, already swollen and purpling, high on his temple, matted with blood and straw. He wasn't an old man, maybe 30, 35. His clothes, though trail-worn, were of decent quality, not the rags of a common drifter. A quick, furtive glance towards the cabin, its windows still dark. Walter wouldn't be stirring for another hour. She had to act fast. Dragging him was out of the question. He was too heavy, and she couldn't risk leaving a trail in the fresh snow that even her father, with his sharp eyes, might overlook. The old tack room, then, it was small, windowless, and seldom used. Now they were down to one horse. It took all her strength, a series of grunting lifts and desperate shoves, but she managed to maneuver him into the relative shelter of the tack room, settling him onto a pile of old grain sacks. His breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the sudden quiet. She found his satchel near where he'd fallen, a sturdy leather affair. Inside, amongst a few spare clothes and a block of what looked like hardtack, was a worn leather wallet. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and haste, fumbled with the clasp. A few dollars, a dog-eared photograph of a plain, unsmiling woman she didn't recognize, and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, precise. It was a letter, or a copy of one, addressed to a Mrs. Henderson in the nearby township of Redemption. It spoke of an agreement, of travel arrangements, of presenting himself as a prospective husband, a mail-order groom, and tucked into a separate compartment of the wallet, a small, creased card, almost like a calling card, but thicker. On it, in faded ink, a simple, strong script read, "Good men build quietly. Abner, a mail-order groom, stood up, most likely, given he was here and not in Redemption, or worse, met with foul play on the road, but that cut on his head." It looked more like a fall than a fight. His name, the letter stated, was Jack Corbin, a carpenter by trade. June stared at the unconscious man. Jack Corbin, a carpenter who built quietly, an orphan, she'd later learn, who'd found his way to the carpentry trade under the tutelage of a kind, quiet foster father named Abner, a man who, by his own quiet admission when he finally could speak, never expected much from anyone, certainly not to be chosen. He'd sent his letter more on a whim, a fragile hope against a lifetime of knowing his own solitary nature, than with any real expectation of a reply, let alone acceptance. A wave of something she couldn't quite name washed over her. Pity, yes, but something else too. A kinship, perhaps. She knew about suppressed hopes, about the quiet ache of loneliness in a landscape that offered little solace. She covered him with a moth-eaten horse blanket, her movements quick and efficient. Then, she meticulously swept the straw in the empty stall, erasing any sign of his presence. The snow outside the barn door, she'd have to be careful. Her own tracks were normal. An extra set, leading nowhere, would be a beacon to her father's suspicion. Back in the small cabin, the air was already heavy with Walter Mallory's silent disapproval before he'd even fully risen. He sat at the table, staring into his empty coffee cup, and when June placed his usual plate of sourdough bread and bacon before him, he merely grunted. He didn't look at her. He rarely did. Not directly, unless she'd transgressed in some significant way. His silence was a tightening vice. "Snow's deep," she offered, trying for normalcy. He picked up his fork, then set it down with a little too much force. Clink. The sound echoed in the strained quiet. Barn secure. Yes. Pa checked it first thing. Her heart hammered. He grunted again, a sound of dismissal, and finally began to eat. His movements deliberate, almost aggressive. June ate quickly. Her own food, tasteless. The weight of the secret in the tack room pressed down on her, as heavy as the snow blanketing the world outside. Later that morning, when Walter had taken his rifle and gone out, ostensibly to check snares, but more likely just to escape the confines of the cabin and her presence, June hurried back to the barn. Jack Corbin was still unconscious. She cleaned the wound on his temple as best she could with water from the pump. Ice cold, but it would have to do. And a strip of clean linen torn from an old petticoat. His skin was cold to the touch. She piled more sacks around him. Another blanket. She dribbled a little water between his lips, and to her relief, he swallowed. A faint, reflexive action. The day crawled by. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She imagined her father returning early, his sharp eyes missing nothing. She pictured him flinging open the tack room door. The consequences were unthinkable. He wouldn't understand. He wouldn't even try. He'd see a drifter, a threat, and act accordingly. His justice was swift and uncompromising, like the land itself. That evening, supper was an exercise in nerve-shredding tension. Walter was more withdrawn than usual. He ate little, pushed his plate away, and when June reached for his bowl to clear it, he brought his hand down and deliberately upturned it on the scrubbed pine table. The thick stew pooled, then began to drip onto the floor. He said nothing, just stared at the mess, then at her, his eyes flat and hard. Then he rose, scraped his chair back with a grating sound, and retired to his small, curtained-off sleeping alcove, leaving her to clean up the mess in a silence that screamed his displeasure. Was it about the depleted stores, her mood, or did he sense something? Some infinitesimal shift in the oppressive equilibrium of their lives. June's hands trembled as she wiped the table, her gaze darting to the window, to the dark shape of the barn against the snow. Later, under the cloak of a moonless, star-pricked night, she smuggled a little broth and some bread out to the tack room. She found Jack Corbin stirring, his eyes fluttering open. They were a startlingly clear blue, confused and clouded with pain. "Easy now," she whispered, kneeling beside him, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows. "You're safe. You're in my father's barn." He tried to sit up, winced, and fell back with a groan. "Where?" His voice was a dry croak. "Near redemption. You took a bad fall. I think. Found you this morning." He blinked, trying to focus on her. Redemption. A flicker of something. Despair. Crossed his face. "Henderson. She wasn't there for you, was she?" June asked softly, though it was more statement than question. He closed his eyes briefly. A sigh escaped him, so faint it was almost lost in the rustle of the hay. No, she wasn't." He looked at her then, a long, searching gaze that made her feel strangely exposed. Why are you helping me?" June hesitated. The truth was complex, a tangle of pity, a strange sense of responsibility, and an even stranger, unacknowledged flicker of something else, something that felt dangerously like hope, a fragile seedling in the frozen ground of her existence. My father. He wouldn't understand. That much was undeniably true. He's a hard man. Jack Corbin looked at her, his gaze unwavering despite the pain that etched lines around his eyes. Most men are out here. You need to stay hidden, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. At least until you're stronger, until the weather breaks. Then we'll see. He nodded slowly, the effort clearly costing him. Thank you, he rasped. I'm Jack Corbin. June Mallory, she replied, and in the cold, secret darkness of the tack room, with the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, and the weight of her father's silent judgment pressing in from the nearby cabin, a fragile connection was forged. June Mallory, who had lived her life under the thumb of a man who used silence as a weapon, found herself drawn to the quiet carpenter, a man whose life's motto, learned from a long-lost foster father, was that good men build quietly. She didn't know what he would build here, or if he'd even get the chance, but as she tended to him in those stolen moments, a tiny, almost imperceptible warmth began to thaw the numbness in her own heart. the depleted farm, the biting snow, the crushing loneliness. For the first time, they didn't seem quite so absolute. There was a stranger in the stable, and somehow, that changed everything. The days that followed settled into a hushed, careful rhythm, dictated by the howl of the blizzard, giving way to the brittle silence of a world entombed in white. Jack Corbin, true to the quiet strength June had first sensed in him, never once asked to stay. He never offered lengthy explanations for his past, nor apologies for his presence, as his strength returned, a little more each day under June's furtive care. Sips of broth, carefully saved portions of their meager meals, and the clean bandages she provided, he simply began to do. It started small, the loose handle on the old water bucket in the tack room. He somehow found the means to secure it, binding it with a thin strip of leather he'd coaxed from a worn-out rein. A wobbly leg on the milking stool June used for Bess. He steadied it, the repair almost invisible. These were tasks no one had asked of him. Chores. June had long since learned to work around, or simply hadn't had the heart or time to mend on a farm that seemed to be unraveling faster than she could stitch it back together. He moved with a quiet economy. His hands, though still bearing the roughness of his trade and the recent ordeal, surprisingly deft. He worked, June thought, as if he were mending the broken parts within himself. Each small act of restoration, a balm to some unseen wound. He never complained, never spoke of hardship beyond the simple admission of Mrs. Henderson's absence. His past was a closed book, yet his actions spoke of a man accustomed to making do, to building rather than despairing. June found herself watching him during her stolen visits to the barn. He'd be sitting, perhaps, whittling a piece of scrap wood with a small knife from his satchel, his brow furrowed in concentration, or simply staring out the single grimy pane of the tack room's tiny, high window, his gaze distant. When he'd turned that gaze on her, those clear blue eyes, there was no artifice, no attempt at charm or flirtation such as she'd occasionally encountered from ranch hands in town on a Saturday night. Instead, there was a simple, direct acknowledgement. He saw her. He saw the weariness that settled in the lines around her own eyes, the strength in her capable hands, the quiet determination that kept her putting one foot in front of the other. Day after bleak day, for the first time, June felt her own strength not as a burden that isolated her, nor as something to be hidden lest it challenge, but as something simply seen and accepted. It was a heady, unsettling, and deeply warming sensation. Walter, of course, was another matter. June lived on a knife's edge of anxiety, certain that any moment he would discover her secret. He was a man who noticed everything, from a misplaced tool to a change in the wind's direction. How he hadn't yet sniffed out the presence of another soul on their land was a small miracle she attributed to the severity of the weather, keeping him mostly cabin-bound, and perhaps to Jack's almost preternatural quietness. But Walter was no fool. He began to observe, not directly, never that, but from the corner of his eye, with a narrowing of his gaze that June knew all too well. One morning, after a particularly sparse breakfast, where Walter had pushed his plate away with more than half his bacon untouched, June found the leftover portion set aside on the warming shelf of the stove, separate from her own. This was unheard of. Walter never left food. Waste was anathema to him. Later, when she took Jack his meal, the extra bacon lay heavy in the small pail. She didn't mention it. Jack didn't ask, but a silent message had been passed, one June was almost too afraid to interpret. Then came the tests, subtle and unspoken. Walter's way of probing the world, of gauging a man, a section of fence near the woodpile. One June knew had been sturdy, suddenly sported a loose rail, a few nails conspicuously worked free and lying on the snow-dusted ground nearby. Walter complained about it at supper. a low grumble directed at the universe rather than at June. Fence'll be down by spring if a man doesn't see to it. Stock'll wander. Given they only had Bess, who wouldn't wander past her feed bucket. It was a statement loaded with something else. The next morning, June saw her father walk past that section of fence. He paused, looked at it, then at the woodpile where Jack, now stronger, had been permitted by June to split some of the smaller logs she usually wrestled with. Walter's old, familiar hammer, the one with the worn hickory handle, lay on the top rail of the fence, right beside the loose board. He said nothing, just continued on his patrol of their small, snowbound territory. When June next crept to the barn, Jack was not in the tack room. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had he gone? Had Walter found him? Then she heard it. The rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a hammer from the direction of the woodpile. She found Jack there, his borrowed coat dusted with fresh snow, patiently, expertly, securing the loose rail. He looked up as she approached, a faint questioning in his eyes. "My father," June began, then trailed off, unsure what to say. Jack merely nodded, then gestured with the hammer towards the rail. Seemed like it needed doing. He didn't mention the convenient placement of the tool. He didn't need to. A few days later, the rickety gate to the small kitchen garden, sagging on its leather hinges for years, was suddenly straighter, swinging smoothly, a new wooden peg securing its latch. Walter, coming in for his midday meal, paused by it, pushed it open, then closed it. He ran a calloused thumb over the new peg. He didn't look towards the barn. He didn't say a word. But that evening, as June was banking the fire, he spoke, his voice gruff, his gaze fixed on the flames. "That wood, Jack's splitting. Tell him to cut it shorter." June froze. It was the first time Walter had used Jack's name. The first direct acknowledgement that he knew the man was there, was working. "Shorter. Puh, He poked at a log with the toe of his boot. Don't want the girl, he meant her, June. Though he rarely addressed her so directly with anything resembling consideration, having to stoop so much to get it in the stove. Hard on her back, June could only stare at his profile, a maelstrom of emotions churning within her. It was the closest thing to an expression of care, however obliquely delivered. She'd heard from him in years, and it was linked to Jack. The dynamic on the Mallory farm began to shift, subtly, like the slow melt of snow under a strengthening sun. Jack was no longer confined to the tack room. He took his meals in the barn, but the portions June brought were larger now, supplemented by unspoken contributions from Walter's plate. He worked openly, repairing the myriad small erosions of time and neglect around the farm. A loose shingle here, a drafty window frame there. He moved with that quiet competence, asking for nothing, yet giving of his skill, his labor. He was the one who didn't ask, but stayed, and in staying, began to fill a void June hadn't consciously acknowledged was there. She found herself seeking out his quiet company, ostensibly to bring him water, or to discuss a needed repair. The conversations were never long, never delved too deep, yet a comfortable understanding grew between them. He spoke a little of Abner, his foster father, of the satisfaction of working with wood, of shaping something useful and solid from raw material. Abner used to say, he remarked one afternoon, sanding a rough patch on a new axe handle he was fitting, that a man's character is like wood grain, some smooth, some gnarled, but all of it tells a story. He didn't look at her, just ran his hand over the smoothing wood. But June felt the comment settle deep inside her. He never asked about her life, about her mother's passing when she was just a girl, about the long, silent years with Walter. But sometimes, when she spoke of a frustration with the failing pump or the dwindling stores, his gaze would rest on her with a profound empathy that needed no words. He understood. She realized the weight of unspoken sorrows, the burden of carrying on when the load seemed too heavy. The farm was still depleted, the future still uncertain. Walter Mallory was still a man of granite silences and unpredictable moods, but the air in the small cabin and in the wider expanse of the snow-covered fields felt different, less charged with despair, touched by a tentative, unspoken hope. June found herself humming sometimes as she went about her chores, a forgotten habit from a lighter time. She noticed the way the low winter sun caught the few strands of silver in Jack's dark hair when he removed his hat, the way his calloused fingers handled tools with such respect and precision. He was, she thought, like one of the sturdy, wine-stunted pines that clung to the ridges above their valley, not showy, but resilient, deeply rooted, and quietly, undeniably, alive. And he was building, not just fences and gates, but something else, something intangible, in the quiet, frozen heart of the Mallory homestead. The last of the heavy snows had finally begun to recede, grudgingly, unveiling a landscape weary from winter's harsh grip, but holding the faint promise of spring. A new life had even made a fragile entrance onto the Mallory homestead. Old Bess, against all odds and Walter's pragmatic expectations, had foaled a sturdy little colt a few weeks prior, a dappled gray creature of surprising spirit. Jack had been the one to assist, his large, capable hands gentle and sure as he'd helped the gangly creature into the world. The colt, which June had impulsively named Sparky for the mischievous glint in his eyes, became a small, shared point of light, a testament to endurance. Jack, now an undeniable presence, moved between the cabin and the slowly reviving outbuildings with a quiet purpose that had begun to feel as natural as the changing seasons. He still spoke little, but his actions continued to build a narrative of steadfastness. He'd taken to mending not just the physical structures of the farm, but also, it seemed to June, the frayed edges of their daily existence. He and Walter still exchanged few words, but a grudging respect had settled between the two men, thick as the smoke from Walter's evening pipe. The air in the cabin, while still carrying the weight of Walter's ingrained austerity, no longer felt choked with unspoken recriminations. The night the fire came, a fickle late spring wind had sprung up, rattling the window panes and making the flames in the cabin stove dance erratically. June had been mending a tear in one of Jack's work shirts by the lantern light, a domestic act that felt both novel and deeply comfortable. Jack was out in the barn, checking on Bess and the colt, a nightly ritual he'd adopted. Walter sat in his usual chair, ostensibly reading an old almanac, though June suspected he was more aware of the quiet rhythm of their lives than he let on. A shout, sharp and urgent, ripped through the uneasy peace. Fire, June. Walter, barns afire. June's heart seized. She was through the door in an instant. Walter, a grim shadow behind her. The sight that met them was a raw, terrifying beauty. Flames, hungry and orange, licked at the old, dry timbers of the barn, already consuming one end, the wind whipping sparks into the dark sky like malevolent stars. The acrid smell of burning hay and wood choked the air. Bess, Sparky, June cried, starting forward. But Jack was already a silhouette against the inferno, wrestling with the main barn door. He wrenched it open, smoke and heat billowing out. Without a moment's hesitation, he plunged inside. Jack, June screamed, a terror colder than any winter wind clutching her. Walter gripped her arm, his fingers like iron bands. Stay put, girl. He knows horses. His voice was rough, strained, but held a note of command she couldn't disobey. They watched, helpless, as shadows moved within the blazing structure. Then, Bess erupted from the doorway, wild-eyed and whinnying in terror. Jack at her flank, slapping her rump to drive her towards the open corral. He turned back, disappearing once more into the roaring heart of the fire. Seconds stretched into an eternity. June could hear the panicked neighing of the colt, the crackle and roar of the flames devouring decades of Mallory history. Just when she thought she could bear it no longer, Jack emerged again, stumbling, soot-blackened, his shirt smoldering. He carried the terrified colt in his arms, shielding its small body with his own. He staggered towards them, laid the trembling animal at June's feet, then sank to his knees, coughing violently. His hands, June gasped. His hands and forearms were a mess of angry red burns, the skin already blistering, his scorched shirt sleeves hanging in tatters. Yet, even as he fought for breath, his primary concern seemed to be the colt, his gaze seeking reassurance that it was unharmed. Walter moved then, a swiftness June hadn't seen in him for years. He helped Jack to his feet, his touch surprisingly steady on the younger man's arm. They stood for a moment, the three of them, watching the barn roof groan and collapse inwards in a shower of embers, the fire consuming their past, their livelihood. Old Bess stood shivering in the corral, nudging her equally terrified foal. Everything else in the barn, tools, tuck, years of stored hay, was gone. Jack swayed, and June rushed to his side. "Your hands, Jack. Dear God, your hands." He looked down at them, as if surprised to find them injured. A faint grimace, his only acknowledgement of the pain. "Colt's safe," he rasped, his voice raw from smoke. "Bess, too." Walter stared at Jack, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the roar of the flames and Jack's ragged breathing. Then, Walter Mallory did something June had never witnessed in her entire life. He nodded, a single, slow, deliberate inclination of his head towards Jack. It wasn't praise. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Acknowledgement. Respect. The fight to save what little remained of the other outbuildings lasted till dawn, a desperate battle with wet sacks and buckets of water. By the time the sun rose on a scene of smoldering devastation, they were all exhausted, soot-stained, and heartsick. Later that morning, June found a small, battered wooden box, the farm's meager medicine chest, sitting on the step outside the cabin's main door. The door itself was slightly ajar. Walter was nowhere to be seen, likely surveying the ruins of his domain. But the message was clear. Help was being offered. However silently, June gently, carefully, cleaned and dressed Jack's burns with the salves from the box. He bore her ministrations with his usual stoicism, his eyes often closed, though whether from pain or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. His hands, those capable, quiet hands that had mended so much, were now swathed in white linen, rendered temporarily useless. The sight of them, so still and bandaged, brought an ache to her chest that was sharper than the loss of the barn. She finished her task, her touch lingering on his uninjured arm. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the kitchen stove. Outside, the world felt raw and exposed. "Jack," she said softly, her voice a little unsteady. He opened his eyes, his clear blue gaze meeting hers. "Marry me, Jack." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, not born of some flighty, romantic fancy, nor whispered in the heat of a passionate moment. They were spoken in the cold light of a devastating morning, grounded in something far more solid. Trust? Trust in his quiet strength, his unwavering steadfastness, the profound integrity she had witnessed time and again, culminating in his selfless courage in the face of the flames. A flicker of surprise, then a deep, searching look entered his eyes. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, a slow smile, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, transformed his soot-stained face. It reached his eyes, warming them, chasing away some of the pain. "June," he said, his voice still hoarse. "Are you sure? A man with nothing, with hands like these?" He gestured vaguely with a bandaged arm. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, her own voice gaining strength. "We'll rebuild. Together. Good men build quietly. Remember," she touched the place where she knew he kept Abner's card. His smile deepened. "Aye, together." They were married a week later, as the first green shoots of spring dared to pierce the thawing earth. There was no fanfare, no guests beyond Walter, who stood as a silent, imposing witness. June wore a cream-colored wool dress, one her mother had sewn years ago. It had been stored in a chest in the main cabin, but a stray ember from the barn fire, carried by the wind, had found its way through a crack in the roof and singed the hem. June had meticulously repaired the damage, but she'd left a small, visible trace of the scorched fabric, a faint brown tracery against the cream. It was her testament, she thought, to having overcome fire, to finding love and commitment amidst the ashes. Walter, for his part, had offered no congratulations, but he'd uncharacteristically opened a dusty bottle of elderflower wine his wife had made long ago, pouring 3 small glasses. He'd raised his, not to them, but in a silent toast towards the window, perhaps to the memory of his wife, or to the unforgiving land itself. Before downing it in one gulp, life settled into a new pattern. The rebuilding of the barn was slow, arduous work, hampered by Jack's healing hands, but they persevered. June worked alongside him, her initial awkwardness with tools giving way to a growing competence. Walter, too, lent his strength, the 3 of them laboring in a mostly silent accord that was more companionable than any June had ever known. Months later, as the colt, Sparky, grew sturdy and bold, mirroring the quiet strength of the man who'd saved him, June knew she carried Jack's child. The knowledge was a quiet joy, a burgeoning hope that echoed the slow rebirth of the farm. One evening, as autumn painted the plains in hues of gold and russet, June found Jack in the shell of the new barn, working by lantern light. He was carefully sanding a piece of wood, its surface bearing the dark, swirling patterns of fire char. It was a section of a sturdy beam salvaged from the old barn. "What are you making?" she asked, resting a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of him. He looked up, his eyes tender. "A cradle," he said, his voice soft. He ran a bandaged, healing hand over the wood. Strong wood, been through the fire, like us. He picked up a small whittling knife and, with painstaking care, began to carve something into the side of the headboard. June leaned closer. It was her name, June, intertwined with a small, stylized flame, the letters flowing into the wood as if they'd always belonged there. She watched him, her heart full, the sweat of their labor, the rust of old ways yielding to new bonds, the fire that had tested and ultimately forged their love. It was all there, in the scarred wood, in the quiet man, in the promise of the new life they were building, piece by patient piece. From the ashes, what did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The raw wound of the burnt barn slowly scarred over, replaced by the sturdy, new timbered frame, Jack and Walter, with June's tireless help, raised against the vast Montana sky. Jack never presumed to call Walter pet, or anything other than Walter on the rare occasions direct address was unavoidable. Yet, a different kind of kinship, forged in shared labor and unspoken respect, began to bind them. Walter, a man whose trust was harder won than water from stone in a drought, started to rely on Jack, It wasn't spoken, of course. It was in the way he'd leave a particularly tricky fence repair for Jack's steadier hands, or how he'd wordlessly pass him the tools to fix a split in the cattle trough, knowing the job would be done right, without fuss or fanfare. Sometimes, when the coyotes yipped too close to the small flock of sheep they'd begun to rebuild, Walter would simply nod towards the rifle by the door, and Jack would take the night watch, a silent guardian under the prairie stars. Walter hadn't offered a blessing at their simple wedding. No words of congratulation had crossed his lips, but a few days after, as June sat darning a sock by the evening lamplight, Jack quietly mending a piece of harness beside her, Walter had risen from his chair. He'd gone to the old cedar chest that held his late wife's few precious belongings, a chest June hadn't seen opened in years. After a moment, he returned, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. He stopped before June, his shadow falling over her mending. In his calloused, work-worn hand, he held out a small, velvet-worn box. June looked up, her breath catching. He opened it. Nestled inside was a simple gold band, her mother's wedding ring. His gaze didn't meet hers. It was fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "Your mother would have wanted you to have it," he'd said, his voice gruff, almost harsh, as if daring her to make an emotional display. He placed the box in her lap. Beside it, he laid a folded quilt, its pattern the intricate flying geese her mother had pieced together through long winters past. Its colors faded, but its stitching still strong. And finally, a creased, official-looking document, the deed to the Mallory land, now with an addendum, crudely but legally penned by the circuit judge in redemption, naming June and Jack Corbin, her husband, as joint inheritors. June could only stare, tears welling, blurring the lamplight into a halo. She reached for his hand, the one that had offered these treasures, these silent admissions of acceptance, of continuity. "Pa," she'd whispered, the word tasting unfamiliar, but right on her tongue. He'd pulled his hand away, almost roughly, cleared his throat, and retreated to his chair, picking up his almanac as if nothing monumental had occurred. But the air in the cabin had shifted, softened. The door to Walter Mallory's heavily guarded heart had creaked open, just a little wider. The conversations between June and her father began to change too, slowly, tentatively. The old patterns of avoidance, of words left unsaid, hanging heavy between them, started to fray. One evening, as Jack was out checking the fences before a predicted storm, June found herself alone with Walter. She was heavy with child then, the curve of her belly a gentle mound beneath her apron. "He's a good man. You're Jack," Walter said, startling her. He was staring into the fire, his profile etched by the flames. "Yes, Pa, he is." A long silence. Then, I didn't know how to be a father to a daughter who didn't need coddling. Your mother, she knew how to soften things. I only ever knew how to be hard." He paused, turning a piece of kindling over and over in his hands. "But it seems you found a man who ain't afraid of that strength in you. Doesn't try to break it, or bend it to his will." He looked at her then, a quick, almost shy glance. "That's a rare thing." June's heart swelled. "He sees it as just part of me, like the color of my eyes." Walter nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. That's how it should be." Not all the world was as accepting, or perhaps as willing to let go of old narratives. The encounter with Hank Miller in Redemption proved to be more than a passing slight. Hank, it seemed, wasn't content to let the matter rest. It was a few weeks later, on a day when Walter himself had ridden into town for some seed grain, that Hank saw his opportunity. He found Walter at the saloon, nursing a single beer, a rare indulgence. June learned of it later, piecing it together from Jack's quiet observations of Walter's mood that evening and, eventually, from Walter's own terse, reluctant admission. Hank, emboldened by a few too many whiskeys and the absence of June's sharp tongue, had approached Walter's table, all false bonhomie and ill-concealed malice. "Walter Mallory," Hank had boomed, loud enough for half the saloon to hear. "Good to see you, though I confess, I worry for you." "Man, and for your June?" Walter had merely looked at him, his eyes flat and cold. "Worry about your own fences." "Miller, now, just a neighborly concern." Hank pressed on, pulling up a chair uninvited. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper. "It's about that Corbin fellow, the one June up and married. Word gets around, you know, and the word ain't good." Walter remained silent, his gaze unwavering. This, June knew, was when her father was most dangerous, when he let the other man talk, giving him enough rope. "They say," Hank continued, warming to his task, "that he ain't no simple carpenter. Some folks down Texas way remember a Jack Corbin, a smooth talker with a fast hand at cards. Left a string of debts and a couple of broken hearts. One man even said Corbin ran off with the payroll from a logging camp. Just vanished. Till he shows up here, looking like a drowned rat, playing the innocent." Hank sat back, a smug look on his face. "A man like that, Walter, he ain't changed. He's just biding his time, waiting for his chance. And you got that prime land. And June, well, she's a Mallory. Comes with a certain inheritance." June felt a chill when Walter recounted this part, his voice devoid of inflection. For a terrifying moment, she imagined her father's old suspicions, his deep-seated mistrust of outsiders, flaring back to life. Had Hank's poison found fertile ground? Walter had apparently taken a slow sip of his beer, his eyes never leaving Hank's face. The saloon had grown quiet, the other patrons sensing a confrontation brewing. "That so, Miller," Walter finally said, his voice deceptively mild. "You seem to know a powerful lot about a man you've barely laid eyes on." "Just passing on what I hear," Hank said, though his bravado seemed to shrink a little under Walter's steady gaze. "A man's got a right to know who he's lettin' into his family, onto his land. A man's got a right to use his own judgment," Walter countered, his voice hardening. "And my judgment tells me some men talk to hear the sound of their own voice. Others talk because their own lives are so empty, they got to try and muddy up someone else's." He paused, and June could picture the scene, her father's gaze like chips of winter ice. "My wife, Sarah, God rest her, she used to say, 'Still waters run deep, Walter, but shallow streams babble the loudest.' Are you, Miller, you're a babbler." Hank's face flushed a dull red. "Now see here, Mallory, I'm just trying to warn you. You're trying to stir trouble where there ain't none." Walter cut him off, his voice a low growl. "You had your eye on June once, and she saw right through you. Still stings, does it? Makes you want to tear down what she's built with a better man." Walter leaned forward slightly. "Let me tell you something about Jack Corbin. I've seen him work. I've seen him face hardship without a word of complaint. I saw him walk into a wall of fire to save my stock, to save a helpless colt. When other men, his gaze flickered around the saloon. Daring anyone to challenge him would have stood back and watched it all burn. That ain't the mark of a thief or a card sharp. That's the mark of a man, a true one." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly on the wooden floor. "So you take your tales and your worries, Miller, and you peddle them elsewhere. My family, my farm, my son-in-law, they ain't your concern." He threw a coin on the table. "And for the record, Hank, your father was a talker, all wind and no grit. Seems the apple didn't fall far from that rotten tree." With that, Walter had turned and walked out, leaving Hank sputtering in a stunned, suddenly attentive silence. Recounting it to June, Walter had concluded, with a rare, dry chuckle, figured the fool needed to understand that some doors, once closed, are best left unopened, and some men, once tested, prove their worth beyond any wagging tongue's deceit. He looked towards the new barn, a solid silhouette against the twilight. Any man can spin a yarn, but only fire shows a man's true metal. You're Jack. He's pure gold, refined by it. Miller wouldn't last a minute in a real trial. June had felt a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. Her father, the man of stone and silence, had not only defended Jack, but had articulated a deep understanding and acceptance of his character, shielding their newfound peace from outside malice. The baby, a son, was born as the first snows of the next winter began to fall, mirroring the season of Jack's arrival. He had Jack's clear blue eyes and a thatch of dark hair. They named him Samuel, after June's grandfather, but also for the quiet strength the name seemed to imply. When June was strong enough to sit up, Jack brought the cradle he'd fashioned from the fire-scarred barnwood into their small cabin. It stood sturdy and beautiful, a testament to survival and love. June's name, a silent blessing carved into its side. Walter approached it slowly, his gaze fixed on the small, sleeping bundle. He looked older now, the lines on his face deeper, but some of the harshness had eased from his eyes. He reached out a hand, then hesitated. His fingers, gnarled from a lifetime of hard labor, trembling slightly. June watched. Her breath held. She remembered those hands, capable of bending spoons in silent fury, of delivering the swift, hard justice of the frontier. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, Walter Mallory gently, carefully, lifted his grandson from the cradle. The baby stirred, made a small snuffling sound, and settled against the rough wool of Walter's shirt. The old man's hands, June noted with a quiet wonder, were perfectly steady now. He held Samuel not with the awkwardness she might have expected, but with a surprising tenderness, a natural grace. A faint, almost imperceptible softening touched Walter's craggy features as he looked down at the new life in his arms. June exchanged a look with Jack over Walter's bent head. The burdens of the past, the unspoken griefs and misunderstandings that had haunted the Mallory line, seemed to lift in that moment, like mist in the morning sun. The door to her father's heart, once so firmly barred, now stood open, letting in the light. The quiet carpenter, the stranger who'd come out of the storm, hadn't just rebuilt a barn. He'd helped rebuild a family, mending fences of the heart with the same quiet skill he applied to wood and stone. And in the steady gaze of the old man holding his grandson, June saw not just acceptance, but the fragile, precious bloom of peace, a peace strong enough to withstand any poisonous whisper from a bitter world. The seasons that followed Walter's steadfast defense of Jack in redemption unfurled with a newfound sense of peace on the Mallory homestead. It was a peace as sturdy and unadorned as the new barn they had raised together, its timbers smelling of fresh-cut pine and honest labor. This quietude was different from the heavy silence of years past. It was a comfortable stillness, born not of suppressed emotion or unspoken resentments, but of acceptance, of burdens shared and hurts gently acknowledged. June and Jack moved through their days in a synchronous rhythm. Their love, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their work. The anticipation of their coming child was a warm, steady undercurrent, a secret joy that colored even the most mundane chore with a golden light. The land itself, responding to their combined, hopeful efforts, seemed to breathe easier. The pastures a little greener, the small vegetable patch June tended with new enthusiasm, offering up a slightly more generous yield than in many a lean year. Jack, his hands long healed though forever bearing the faintest, silvery tracery of scars, a roadmap of survival and sacrifice, had poured his quiet heart into the cradle. He'd chosen the woods with care. Strong oak salvaged from the burned barn for the frame, symbolizing resilience. Lighter, smoother pine for the rocker slats, whispering of gentleness. Each sanding motion, each perfectly fitted joint, had been a meditation, a prayer for the small life to come. June would often find him in the evenings, the lantern light casting long shadows in the workshop he'd fashioned in a corner of the new barn, running his hand over the smoke-kissed wood, a look of profound tenderness, almost awe, on his face. He was building not just a bed, but a promise. She, in turn, found a unique solace in her mother's old journal. Its pages, brittle and yellowed with time, were filled with a faded, elegant script, detailing the daily joys, the quiet sorrows, the unwavering faith of a life lived out on that same demanding land. June began to add her own entries, her handwriting rounder, less practiced than her mother's, but filled with the immediacy of her own experiences. Walter smiled at Jack today when they finally coaxed the old pump handle to work smoothly. Just a quick upturn of his lips, gone in an instant, but it felt like the first real sunshine after a long, hard winter. Or, when the baby first quickened within her, felt the little one kick this afternoon while I was mending Jack's shirt. Such a strong, insistent flutter. Jack put his hand on my belly, right over mine, and his eyes. They held a whole world of wonder, a reflection of my own amazement. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. It was her way of weaving their present. Jack's quiet strength, Walter's slow thaw, her own burgeoning motherhood, into the enduring tapestry of the past, of feeling her mother's spirit beside her. A comforting presence connecting the generations of Mallory women. The wedding dress, with its carefully mended scorch mark along the hem, lay folded in the cedar chest. It was more than a garment. It was a symbol. Sometimes, in the quiet of an afternoon, June would take it out, her fingers tracing the delicate floral embroidery her mother had so lovingly stitched. Then the starker, slightly puckered line of the burn. Love, she mused, like strong, seasoned timber, could endure fire, could even be tempered by it, emerging not weakened, but more resilient, its beauty deepened by the marks of its trials. One crisp autumn afternoon, the scent of wood smoke sweetening the air and the cottonwoods along the creek shimmering like molten gold, Walter approached them. Jack and June sat on the porch steps, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder, his arm a warm, solid presence around her. June was well into her last months, her belly a proud, round testament to the life within. Walter held the land deed, the same one he had given them in the quiet aftermath of their wedding. He stopped before them, not looking directly at either, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line of the mountains, a familiar pose that now spoke less of avoidance and more of a man gathering his thoughts. This land, he began, his voice raspy, yet carrying a new timbre of quiet authority, a settled weight that had replaced the old harshness. It's seen more hardship than most folks see in 5 lifetimes. It's seen joy, too, fleeting sometimes, like a winter thaw, but real. It's seen Mallorys come and seen Mallorys go, each one leaving their mark, their sweat, their heartaches in this soil. He held out the deed, its creases softened from handling. Your mother and I, Sarah, we held it, we guarded it, through drought and blizzard, through lean years that scraped us raw and bitter winters that tested our souls. After she passed, I kept guarding what was left. The memories, the name, the stubborn refusal to let it all turn to dust. He cleared his throat, a rough, gravelly sound. My watch is ending. My part in that guardianship is done. He placed the deed into Jack's outstretched hand, then laid his own weathered, calloused hand atop Jack's and June's clasped ones for a brief, significant moment. The touch was surprisingly gentle. Now, It's your turn. You two, you look ahead. You build what comes next. For yourselves. For that little one, on the way. His gaze finally met theirs. Direct and clear. Don't look back too much. Unless it's to draw strength. The future ain't made by staring at yesterday's sorrows. It's built with today's hands. With that, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and walked towards the barn. His shoulders, June thought, perceptibly lighter, as if a great, ancestral weight had finally been set down. The night their son, Samuel, decided to make his determined entrance into the world, a fierce late autumn storm blew in, a roaring, elemental reminder of the untamed nature of the land they called home. Wind howled around the eaves of the small cabin like a hungry wolf, rattling the newly secured window panes, and rain lashed down in blinding, horizontal sheets. Jack, his face etched with a tender concern for June, but his hands remarkably steady, was preparing to brave the elements. His ingrained instincts to protect, to secure, were flaring. He needed to check the new roof of the barn, to ensure the animals were safe and calm against the storm's fury. June watched him from the warmth of their bed, her heart a tight knot of love, pride, and the inevitable anxiety of a woman on the cusp of childbirth. She gripped his hand tightly as another contraction seized her, stealing her breath. "Be careful, Jack," she whispered when she could speak, her voice strained. "Please." He squeezed her hand, his clear blue eyes full of a deep, reassuring love that was her anchor. Always, June. For you, for us. But as he reached for the heavy wooden door latch, it creaked open from the outside, pushed by a force stronger than the wind. Walter stood framed in the doorway, a lit lantern held high in one hand, his old oilskin slicker plastered to his frame, deflecting the deluge. His gray hair was darkened by rain and plastered to his forehead, but his stance was as resolute as the ancient mountains. "No need, son," Walter said, his voice carrying easily. Surprisingly, over the storm's deafening fury, he looked from Jack's determined face to June's pale one, a deep, almost sorrowful understanding in his aged eyes. "You stay with her. She needs you now, more than any damn roof or skittish animal." He paused, and a look of profound, fatherly concern softened his rugged features. "Tonight, you two stay inside, where it's warm. I'll keep watch. I'll see to things." And he did, through the long, arduous hours of June's labor, as she fought her own valiant, primal battle within the warm, lamplit confines of the cabin. Walter Mallory, the man once of stone and impenetrable silence, patrolled the homestead. He moved like a steadfast sentinel, his lantern a small, defiant beacon against the storm's rage, guarding not just the physical structures, but the precious, nascent future unfolding within their walls. Samuel Walter Corbin was born just as the storm finally began to sigh its surrender. The pre-dawn light painting the bruised eastern sky in fragile hues of lavender and rose. He was small, perfectly formed, with a thatch of dark hair like his father's, and a surprisingly strong, indignant cry that announced his arrival with authority. Jack, his eyes shining with unshed tears of awe and overwhelming relief, held his son for the first precious moments, then gently, reverently, placed him in June's waiting, eager arms. He knelt beside her on the worn rag rug, brushing a stray, damp strand of hair from her forehead. "June," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion too profound for easy words. "All my life, I never truly made plans, never saw the point, really, just took things as they came, braced for the worst, hoped for a little bit of not so bad." He looked from her tired, radiant face to their son, nestled contentedly against her, his gaze filled with a fierce, protective love that seemed to illuminate the room. "But you, June, finding you, and now him. He choked up for a moment. You're the reason I know I can start writing the first real plan of my life. A plan with a future I want to build, not just endure. June smiled through her own happy, exhausted tears, her fingers stroking Samuel's soft cheek. She remembered a conversation they'd had what felt like a lifetime ago, under a canopy of indifferent stars, when their love was still a fragile, unspoken bud. And I told you once, my quiet carpenter, she whispered back, her voice a little shaky, that I'd never really been part of anyone's plan either, always on the outside, looking in, or just bracing myself. But you, Jack Corbin, you were the reason I dared to make a plan for the first time, to hope for more than just getting through another day. Their plans, unspoken in their full detail, yet deeply, intuitively understood, now lay cradled in June's arms, smelling of milk and new beginnings. A few days later, as June rested and regained her strength, Samuel asleep in the fire-scarred cradle beside her bed, she saw Walter approach the cabin from the direction of the workshop. He moved with a new lightness, his steps sure. He didn't enter, perhaps respecting the quiet intimacy of the new mother and child, but he left something on the worn threshold, a single, perfectly shaped and sanded wooden slat, its grain smooth as river stone, clearly intended for the cradle. Jack had mentioned, in passing, that one of the salvaged pieces he'd used for the cradle's base had a slight, almost imperceptible imperfection, a small knot he'd meant to replace but hadn't found quite the right piece for. Walter, in his quiet, observant way, had seen, had remembered, and had provided. He'd offered no explanation, no words at all, just the silent gift, his final, perfect touch on the vessel that would hold and protect his grandson. Jack found it later that afternoon, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face as he tested its fit. It was perfect. He slotted it into place, the old, fire-kissed wood and the newly crafted piece seamlessly, harmoniously joined. June picked up her mother's journal from the bedside table. The last entry from her mother was dated shortly before her passing, a simple, poignant prayer for her daughter's future happiness and well-being. June uncapped her small bottle of blue-black ink, dipped her pen, and, with Samuel's soft breaths, a gentle rhythm beside her, began to write. November 10th. Samuel Walter Corbin sleeps soundly in the cradle his father built with such love, a cradle his grandfather, in his own quiet way, helped complete. The wind whispers at the eaves today, no longer a threat, but a gentle lullaby, a promise of returning spring. The roots here run deep, deeper than I ever knew, and from the ashes of what was lost, something new and incredibly strong is growing. Our son, our future, our plan, finally taking shape, being built quietly, steadfastly, with a love that has weathered fire and storm. It is a good plan. It is a good life. She closed the journal, a sense of profound, bone-deep peace settling over her. The story of the Mallory homestead, of the quiet stranger who came out of a winter storm and stayed to mend more than just fences, of the stoic father's door creaking open to let in the warmth of a new dawn, was far from over. It was, in truth, just finding its truest, most hopeful beginning, a legacy of resilience to be passed down, like the smooth, fire-scarred wood of a baby's cradle. And so concludes this chapter of their lives, a testament to the quiet strength of the human heart and the enduring power of connection. What did you feel as you walked this journey through the seasons with June, Jack, and Walter? Did their struggles, their unspoken communications, and their hard-won victories resonate with your own experiences of love, loss, and healing? We'd dearly love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Your insights and shared feelings enrich these stories for everyone who gathers here. If you found yourself moved by their tale of resilience, love, and the slow, steady mending of hearts on the vast Montana frontier, please consider giving this story a like, and perhaps share it with someone who appreciates a story that takes its time, like a slow river carving its patient path through the plains, or a seed pushing its way through hard ground towards the sun. And, if you haven't already, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on future stories from the heart of the West and beyond. Your support is the sunshine and rain that helps us keep these tales alive and growing.